Hey everyone, welcome back to the show for a very important episode today. We're going to be talking about one of the most important concepts you'll need to understand to get really good in Palestinian Arabic. It's something that's absolutely exists and is important in Fusha, but in Ammiya it's used to an even greater extent. And knowing how and when to use it is the key to sounding natural in speech, rather than like awkwardly literal, as happens to a lot of folks who come from Fusha and they don't adapt properly. So this concept is called the active participle. Again, with the grammar terms, I know, but the active participle might be compared to English ing words like swimming, running, walking, etc., which in English are actually called the present participles. So in Arabic, the active participle is a noun that refers to a subject that is carrying out an action, a verb. But even though the AP, which is what I'm going to call it, the AP, even though the AP directly stems from verbs, so it almost seems to be like a verb form, keep in mind that grammatically it's a noun, not a verb. I wouldn't stress about the distinction, but for what it's worth, it's the same in English. The present participle, so words like swimming, are actually technically nouns. That's why I am swimming. Think of the verb am as like connecting the two nouns, me and the present action of swimming. Anyway, before we look at some active participles and how to use them though, first we have to understand what the active participle is and what it isn't. Notice that although the active participle in Arabic is to some extent analogous to the present participle in English, they have different names. In English it's called the present participle because it contrasts with the past participle. The first refers to the state of doing something, so for example swimming, while the second refers to the state of already having done something, hence the past participle. So words like swum, to say I have swum. So swimming is an ongoing action, whereas swum is a complete action. The reason I want you to understand that though is because although the active participle and the present participle are similar, there's nothing like the past participle in Arabic, and actually the opposite of the active participle in Arabic, you might have guessed it, is the passive participle. So while the first refers to a subject carrying out an action, the second refers to a subject upon which an action is carried out. So we'll discuss the passive participle in a future video, but for now I just want you to understand that distinction, and in the meantime, you learn something cool about English, I guess. Okay, the first thing that we're going to talk about is what they actually look like and how you form them. So as I said, you derive them directly from verbs in the same way as in English you like add the ing suffix to any verb to get the present participle. As you know though, what's super awesome and unique about Arabic is its root system. So to derive different verbs and nouns and adjectives from roots, what you often do is like bend and stretch and transform them in accordance to certain patterns, rather than like adding suffixes as is generally the case with European languages. The nice thing about it though is that you eventually get super quick at identifying these patterns and even like inferring the meanings of words that you've never seen before, if you know the meaning of the root and know what function that pattern has. So this feature of Arabic is also one of the big reasons why Arabic is perfectly suited to having a writing system basically without vowels, because the patterns tend to be pretty fixed, so as long as you can make out the pattern, you know how to pronounce the entire word without needing to see the vowels. So let's take a look at how that works now. So what we're going to do to form the active participle is we're going to take the three-letter root of any verb we know as our template, and we're going to stretch it in accordance to the active participle pattern. Actually, the name of the active participle in Arabic is actually the pattern itself. It's called the ism fa'al, because it's the noun in the pattern of fa'al, which is precisely the pattern that we're going to place roots in to form the active participle. So for example, the verb sima means to hear or to listen. So I hear is basma. But let's put this verb in the active participle pattern now. Basically, all you're going to do is you're going to stretch out the first letter with an alif, and the only other thing is that you're going to put a kasra on the second letter. It always takes a kasra. So it's going to be sama. Before we talk about what all that means though, there's a couple more things to mention with regards to forming the active participle. So thus far in these videos, we've actually only talked about form 1 verbs thus far, which is the most common type anyway. And that includes what form 1 verbs look like when they don't have that standard 3-letter root. So an example of each type would be, for example, sima, which is type A, which has all the letters in the root. Masha, type B, which is missing that last letter of the root. You have hab, which is type C, which has the same last 2 letters in the root. And rah, type D, which has this like missing letter in the middle. So obviously, sama is type A, and the AP, the active participle, is sama. But how do the other types fit in the pattern? It's actually pretty intuitive, but I'll show you how it's done. So type C is the most obvious. You just separate the doubled letters. So the AP of hab is habib. Very simple. In the case of type B though, you follow the pattern until you reach the kasra on the second letter. But since there's nothing after that, you just extend the kasra into a ya, which is honestly the same thing that happens in general. Instead of having masha with just fatha, it becomes masha with alif maksura. So instead of mashi with kasra, it's mashi with ya. Lastly, for type D, since the letter that would normally carry the kasra, so the I sound, is missing, it just goes on top of nothing and thus becomes a hamza. So it would be ra'ih, which I think makes sort of intuitive sense because there's just no letter there. So it just goes on top of nothing. As I mentioned in literally my first video though, in many cases the hamza in spoken Arabic isn't very distinct, especially with this kind of hamza with an I sound. It just sounds like ya with a kasra, so like ra'ih. And that's how it ends up getting written most of the time too. So shayif, jayib, even though in fusha it would be spelled with the hamza. Anyway, that's what happens with type D verbs, where the middle of the middle letter of the root is missing. So the kasra just kind of sits on nothing, so to speak. Now, the $1,000,000 question is, what does all of that even mean? 90% of the time, the AP won't have an exact translation in English because it's a somewhat unique concept. But in many cases, in fact, ra'ih, shayif, and jayib are perfect examples. They work pretty much exactly like one of those ing words, and likewise sama, which we can translate as hearing, I guess. Guess what? This is a really common word, as it's exactly what you say when you're talking like on the phone, for example. Ana sama is literally I'm hearing you, but it's like the equivalent of saying like I can hear you when speaking on the phone. And remember, even though it's derived directly from a verb, the active participle is technically a noun. So the way you negate that is using, as we talked about last time, the word mish, which is for negating nouns. So I am not this or that. So ana sama is if I can hear you on the phone, or you can say mish sama, which is literally I'm not hearing you, but it's the equivalent of saying like I can't hear you. Now before moving forward, I just want to make a note of something. Although I've been saying that the AP is like the present participle and that there's nothing like the past participle in Arabic, it's more that the AP can function as either the present or the past participle. It's just that more often than not, it does have the present meaning. Basically, any given active participle conveys one or the other sense for the original verb, and only in a few cases can it actually convey both meanings. So, for example, the verb tarak means to leave, but huwa tariq doesn't actually mean he is leaving, but rather he has left. Honestly, I've thought about how to figure it out, like if there's some kind of pattern or reason, but I'm still really not sure why you have the present meaning, the present continuous meaning with some verbs, and the past perfect meaning with other verbs. There doesn't really seem to be a predictable way of knowing which it's going to be, so it's good practice to pay attention to how the word is used when you're not sure of that connotation of that particular verb's active participle. I wouldn't worry too much about it though, because if a given active participle has the connotation of is doing, then you can use some tricks I mentioned in another video to say has done. And if the active participle has the connotation of has done, then you can do other things to express the is doing. So as long as you familiarize yourself with those strategies, you'll never really be at a loss for how to express exactly what you mean to say. Just check on that last video to really review those types of strategies. Okay, back to sama and the main present continuous meaning of the active participle. So even though it's not exactly a verb, it's possible to put the active participle in different tenses. But since it's a noun, all you have to do is use the verb to be. So if I can hear you is ana sama, the past tense is kunt sama, which is literally I was hearing you, but it's like I could hear you in the past tense. Likewise, I can't hear you is mish sama, but I couldn't hear you is, again, ma kunt sama. Literally, I wasn't hearing you. And remember, as we talked about in the episode on can, if you negate can like any other verb, well, you use ma and or sheen. But when it's in the present, the can disappears, so the ma and the sheen get smashed together into one word, and that's why in the present it's mish, and in the past it's ma kuntish. And again, what I'm saying right now is actually really common to use in daily speech, as you might need to talk to someone on the phone and be able to say, you know, I can't hear you if the connection is bad or whatever. So the last thing I want to mention about the AP's shape itself is that because it's a set noun rather than a verb, it's never conjugated or anything. So, enta sama, huwa sama. In other words, the active participle basically looks the same with all the pronouns, which is why actually the subject pronoun before the AP tends to get dropped less often than when you have a regular verb, which due to its different conjugations makes the actual pronoun kind of superfluous. There's just one small caveat though, which is that the AP almost works like an adjective in the sense that it does correspond with gender and number. You tack on a tamarbuta for feminine subjects and in for plural subjects. So let's do them all to demonstrate. And I'm just going to use a different AP just so that you can hear it more clearly. Ana fahem, anta fahem, enti fahme, huwa fahem, hiya fahme, احنا فاهمين, انتو فاهمين, هم فاهمين. So as you can see, the whole gender number thing is really not too tough since really the core word is the same. By the way, have you figured out what fahem means? It comes from the root that gives us the verb fihm, which means to understand. But you might still be wondering, okay, well, what's the difference between bafham and fahem? Bafham being the actual sort of present tense for fihm, for understand. Because at least if basma is I hear or listen, it makes sense to use sama if it means I'm hearing or listening. But is there even a difference between bafham and fahem? Well, here's where we start seeing some actual differences between the English present participle and the Arabic active participle. And if you really want to get good in Arabic, it's worth paying attention here, because what you actually find is that in some cases, like with fihm, not only is fahem used, but comparatively, bafham is hardly used at all. This is really important. There are actually many verbs in spoken Arabic where the active participle actually entirely replaces the use of the present tense form. And trust me, you'll thank me later for explaining this now, because this is something I struggled with for a long time. Why, I mean, if it's supposed to be أنا بسكن بفلسطين, are people saying أنا ساكن بفلسطين? And why are they asking me أنت وين ساكن? Why aren't they saying بسكن, تسكن? So yeah, how come for many verbs you use the active participle and sometimes don't ever use the actual present tense at all? So why, for example, can you say أنا بشوف or أنا شايف, but only أنا ساكن is correct, whereas أنا بسكن sounds weird? And most importantly, how do you know when to use which? Well, first of all, again, you can't just translate the active participle word for word as the ing words in English. The key point is that most of the time you can translate the active participle conceptually that way, but that doesn't mean that the words in Arabic are used exactly the same way. To understand that a little bit better, we have to go back to my original definition of the active participle, which is a noun that refers to the state of a subject carrying out an ongoing action. So think about that. The active participle is a state of carrying out an action. So let's keep that in mind on one hand. Now, what about the present tense? What exactly does it convey? Well, there's three main connotations in Arabic, and notice how they translate differently in English. So, ba'ara katir, for example, is like the English present tense. I read a lot. So it's very general and refers to like a habitual action. There's also a continuous connotation if I say halla bokel, which means I'm eating right now, even though notice that in English I use the present participle, whereas in Arabic I just use the simple present. And lastly, the present tense in Arabic can have a future connotation too. So if I say, for example, bukra bihki ma'u, it means tomorrow I will speak with him. So what we're going to do is we're going to ignore the simple present and future connotations, and we're just going to focus on the present continuous connotation. How come bokel is I'm eating, but to say I understand, I would say fahim. Notice that the type of word that's used is actually the opposite of English. This might sound complicated at first, but it's actually simple. It's really just that English and Arabic have exactly opposite treatments of stative verbs. Okay, what the heck does that mean? I'm actually going to quote Wikipedia, the Wikipedia page for stative verb here, because I think it has a fantastic short definition that we can dissect. So, quote, a stative verb is one that describes a state of being, in contrast with a dynamic verb, which describes an action. The difference can be categorized by saying that stative verbs describe situations that are static or unchanging throughout their entire duration, whereas dynamic verbs describe processes that entail change over time. Many languages distinguish between these two types in terms of how they can be used grammatically. End quote. Okay, notice that last point. It's literally what I just mentioned. In English and in Arabic, stative verbs and dynamic verbs are expressed differently. Since stative verbs, such as to know, for example, refer to a static situation, in English it would be redundant to use the present participle, which is used to express an ongoing action. A stative verb is already implicitly ongoing, right? So that's why we say I know rather than I am knowing, right? Which sounds weirdly redundant. Whereas a dynamic verb such as to run requires the present participle to convey the ongoing nature of the action. So running as opposed to like I run in general. As for Arabic though, remember that the active participle refers to the state of carrying out an ongoing action. A state because it's static, in the sense that the situation in question doesn't actually change throughout the duration of the action. So because the present tense in Arabic already has a continuous connotation, you can just say ana bokel to say I'm eating. But if I want to say I live in Palestine, because I'm talking about like an ongoing situation that isn't changing, that's why ana sakin بفلسطين. It's almost like saying I'm a resident of Palestine, in the sense that the word resident, being a noun like the active participle, doesn't connote, I mean it's not a verb, it doesn't connote any type of action or change, and even has like a certain sense of permanence, right? And that's exactly why it's so common to say fahim, even though in English it's the opposite. It would be weird to say I'm understanding rather than just I understand. But in Arabic, while you can say bafham, it has a more specific connotation. I understand something specifically. Likewise, ba'rif is a bit more like I know that, like you know a specific fact or idea, whereas ana a'arif is more like having a general knowledge about something or a situation. Although to be fair, with this particular verb, the two uses are a little bit more interchangeable. Now, the reason I really want to double down on the idea that the active participle is a noun that refers to a state is because the active participle is used for more than just expressing verbs. Let's start by just remembering that some ideas are conveyed through verbs in Arabic don't translate into English. So likewise, the active participle might be translated as something other than a verb. So for example, adar means to be able, and the active participle is adir, basically meaning able. So I am able is ana adir. And as you can see here, the active participle translates as an adjective, although again, that's just because the idea of ability in English isn't conveyed through a verb to begin with. More importantly though, the active participle can also function as a noun sometimes. But before I give you some examples, again, I don't want you to overthink this. I mean, I almost feel like these are just words that are derived from verbs according to the active participle pattern, but aren't like true active participles in that they don't actually function as verbs in any way, to be clear. So for example, I'm sure you know the word talib, meaning student. Well, now you know that talib is actually in the active participle pattern from the verb talab, which means to request. So I guess like the etymology of the origin of the word student is someone who is requesting, or a requester of knowledge, I guess. Likewise, lab is to play, and la'ib is a player, and like a player in a game, in a sport, right? And amil is to work. In fusha, in amiya, it just means to do. But anyway, amil is therefore a worker. So it's almost like, you know, the same way that you add the in English, like worker, player, requester, sometimes, which means like someone who is actively doing that action. It kind of works that way in Arabic too for some verbs. So I would actually say this type of meaning makes sense too then, because again, for the millionth time, if the active participle is the state of a subject carrying out an action, well, a worker is just someone who is working, or someone who works in general. In theory, it's like a state, an unchanging situation. So I wouldn't say that the meaning is counterintuitive. It makes sense, but of course the difficulty is just how do you know which of all the meanings the AP has for any particular verb? Again, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be much of a pattern. So aside from the caveat that I think the present continuous meaning is the most standard, it's a matter of checking and reviewing the meanings of the active participles of the verbs you're learning as you go along. Fortunately, even though you can derive an active participle in theory from literally any verb root, not all verbs, maybe not even most verbs, have an active participle that's actually used in practice. So actually, if you use the spreadsheet that I have linked in the description, that should help a lot because there's a column with all the active participles, but I've only included the ones that I've actually seen used in real life. So you can focus on learning those rather than like worrying over nothing and filling your head with irrelevant words. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about that, honestly. It's definitely a lot of information, and don't get me wrong, I worked a long time on this video and figuring out how to explain everything the best way. And you really don't have to understand everything all at once. In future videos, once we start talking about more like topical things, I'll give you super common and useful active participles, and I think things will start to click much more. But of course, I didn't want to drop them like out of nowhere, so you can always just come back to this video to understand exactly how they're used. Anyway, I hope that was useful, and I'll see you next time. اهلا حبايبي، شكرا للجماعة اللي بيحضروا القناة. اذا بدكم تكملوا تشوفوا هالفيديوز اعملوا سبسكرايب، واذا شفتوني مؤخرا تفضلوا روحوا شوفوا الفيديوز الماضية بالبلاي ليست، وتذكروا اني عملت مصادر لتعليم اللهجة الفلسطينية بتقدروا تلاقوه بالموقع تبعي اللي مكتوب تحت بالدسكريبشن، وبشوفكم المرة الجاي.